Once upon a time, there lived a girl with big dreams and loads of ambition to make them happen. She was friendly. She loved people, especially kids. Never met one she didn't like. She babysat for years and years and years. Junior high, high school, she babysat. College, babysat. Grad school, still babysat. She met a man, she got married, and one day they decided to try for a child of their own. She became a mom and lived happily ever after. Nope. Didn't play out like that. Let's begin again. Once upon a time, things didn't work out as planned. The girl, she struggled with infertility. She looked into adoption. And it seemed like that might be the happily ever after that she'd been hoping for. What's not to love, right? A child needs a home, a family wants a child. Save a child, and everyone lives happily ever after. Perfect, right? This story is mine. I'm the girl. And I once believed in that fantasy. Today, my wiser, stronger, braver self stands before you with the real once upon a time. Once upon a time, the universe had a plan for me. It was not what I envisioned for my life. But then again, I wasn't ever one of those people who had plans like that. I never really had a clear vision. My younger self did not imagine my wedding day or being pregnant or where I would live as an adult. I just didn't take time to think about things like that. Those weren't my kind of dreams. For me, the dream was always about the challenge at hand. When I was 15, I went to a YMCA family camp with my best friend and her family. I loved it. The very first clear dream that I can remember having is that I wanted to work at that YMCA family camp. The second dream was to take my kids someday to that YMCA family camp. More dreams followed. I wanted to lead wilderness trips. I wanted to study biology. I wanted to prove to my dad that I could get a job in that field. I wanted to live in another country. I wanted to skydive. I wanted to move south. I've now made it from Minnesota to Iowa. I wanted to snorkel in the Great Barrier Reef. I wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail. I wanted to see all 50 states. I wanted to learn molecular biology. I wanted to do a triathlon. And I wanted to be a mom. This one for me was big. And once the time seemed right, I was determined. For me, it was never about having a baby. For me, it was always just about being a mom. And so after 2 years of struggle with infertility, it felt like it was time to move on from the having a baby plan to the being a mom plan. A little bit about me, I didn't grow up with religion. As a child of an ex-Catholic and a non-practicing Jew, religion was a very complicated subject, with no real place for discussion and little in terms of common ground. But this was a gift because it allowed me to come up with my own ideas around religion and spirituality. Ideas that made sense to me, even if no one else actually thought the same thing. One important element of my many beliefs was intuition. I like to refer to my intuition as listening to the whisper. Important things come to me in whispers. Whispers that get louder and louder until they eventually are screaming in my ears. This guides my decisions and this is how I live my life. Foster care was no exception. It came to me in a whisper. Over the 2 years that I struggled with infertility, I heard whispers about adoption. I looked into it and I found out about international adoption, about domestic adoption, but when I went to an informational session on foster care, the whisper got louder. My spouse at the time wasn't ready. I waited him out. 5 months later, he agreed to try foster care. We got a lot of calls, but the one that we finally said yes to was 2 boys, ages 2 and 3. A week later, we got a call back. They'd found some family to take those little guys, but they happened to have 2 other boys, also ages 2 and 3, that needed a place. Call the caseworker before you say yes, is what I was told. I called the caseworker. She said, "How do you feel about hyper kids? These boys are very hyper. You need to be ready to deal with it. Do you think you're prepared to handle it?" Well, I had a lot of years of babysitting. We were also young-ish, and we had no other kids, so I figured, yeah, why not? Plus, who is this caseworker? And aren't all 2 and 3-year-olds hyper? And so it began. I met my sons. What I didn't know then was how many struggles there were for them, the least of those being hyperactivity. Early childhood trauma has a powerful life-altering effect on little ones, and these two, I would come to learn, were deeply impacted. In fact, I'm still learning the extent of it. Out of respect for my children, I will not share their stories in this public of a platform, but I will share mine, because I believe in sharing our stories. That is the only way to really know each other. And in knowing each other, we can create connections. And at the end of the day, connection is one of the most powerful forces in the planet. And I like big impact. I'd like to share some of the lessons learned. Number 1, if you want to adopt or foster, make sure that your spouse or partner is on the same page. I have 2 good friends, adoptive parents themselves, who say adoption is not for wimps. True words. It takes a person with a lot of patience, so much more than you thought you were ever capable of, a person with a kind heart, a person with the ability to ask for help, and admit when you mess up. In our situation, that was too much for him, and we went our separate ways. And unfortunately, this is the story for a lot of couples, because this process will test everything you have. Make sure that your whole self is in. It isn't a happily ever after story. It's a life got seriously real, and we found out what we were made of story. And that's not for everyone. Lesson number 2, I was blessed with a voice. Advocacy comes more naturally to me than most things. And being a parent, especially to kids with special needs, has put me more in touch with that over the years. Whether it's talking to their doctor or working with school teams, educating the people in their lives about trauma-informed care, it is a non-stop job advocating for them. So little understanding of trauma and mental health issues and how it impacts children. And now that I see it and I know them, I can't stop advocating. It may be the most important thing that I ever do. Number 3, my life is never boring. I get bored easily. Before kids, I was pretty discontent with my life. I never found fulfillment in the idea of the American dream. I had the job, the husband, the house in the suburbs, the cars, the vacations, the whole package. And I still felt empty. What I have now, I have the up in the middle of the night call to pick up my kid because he's having a hard day, the non-stop mission to entertain my children, the sibling fights, the helping with homework, the 24/7 single parent life. And I'd choose it all again. And on the hardest of days, I remind myself, my life is never boring. My life is never boring. Lesson number 4 is about challenge. I am a self-proclaimed challenge junkie. Yep, you heard my list earlier. I love a good challenge. I'll plan it and I'll make it happen. Parenting my children has been infinitely harder than anything that I have ever done in my life. And remember, I'm a challenge junkie. But the challenge, it fuels me. It fuels me to be a better person, to keep learning and striving to understand, to keep advocating and speaking out and helping people. It is the biggest challenge of my life. It is nowhere near the end. And even on the hardest days, it fulfills something powerful and purposeful inside of me. And I know that's why the whisper came. Most people don't know how to handle the hard, the raw, the fear that comes with parenting kids with trauma histories. A lot of their behavior is counterintuitive. To successfully handle it requires different thinking. It requires an insane amount of patience, the ability to stay calm in spite of chaos, and thoughtful consideration before action. Not saying I always do this, but I can tell you that I strive to. When becoming a single parent, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the kind of parent whose kids were their entire life. But mental health has become my entire life. I think about it in terms of mental illness. I work for the cause, trying to keep my own mental health in a good place. I use my knowledge about it, advocating for or working with my kids nearly all day, every day. Living with people who suffer from mental illness has made me think long and hard about some things. The first of those being societal norms. I don't know typical. All I know is my kids. At ages 2 and 3, when they came to me, I had a steep learning curve because let me tell you, it's nothing like babysitting. The mental health issues from early childhood trauma were very apparent early on, but I didn't know the extent of it for quite some time. Just as I measure my kids' growth by how short their pants are getting, because I can't see it day to day, I'm too close to it, it was the same with mental health. I saw the behaviors, sure. There were a lot of those, but I measured the complexity of their mental health challenges based on how they were doing at childcare. Those folks work with a lot of kids and have somebody to compare to, right? So I would get a phone call to come pick them up or a request for a meeting, followed by a disenrollment notification. I saw this pattern. It happened over and over. I got intense anxiety over this pattern. I still get intense anxiety over this pattern. What I can tell you is that my kids do what all kids do, but they don't do it at the expected time, the correct age, or the normal intensity. They have developmental delays and faulty neuroperception. Their brains live in fear due to their early childhood trauma. So old traumas surface in unexpected ways. Because of this, any trigger, something seemingly quite small to you or me, can set them off. They go into a primitive brain function. This you've probably heard of, the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's the primitive brain function. And because I'm a scientist and I get all excited about this neuroscience, I have to introduce you to the official name of the fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain, which is called the amygdala. The amygdala is very well developed in kids with early childhood trauma. Unfortunately, once kids are out of a traumatic situation, the brain doesn't pick up with normal development. It misfires a lot. Small things lead to triggers, and then triggers lead to unexpected overreactions in situations. I get it, it's their survival strategy, and it keeps them safe. But you combine this with developmental delays. You've got a child who may be chronologically 8 years old, but developmentally he's 3 years old, and experimentally he's 16 years old. It's a really hard combination. It's hard to parent, but then you put this into a school or a childcare situation without the low ratio, it's a disaster. To the untrained eye, these behaviors look like bad behaviors. Through a trauma lens, they look like deep-seated fear. You can't develop other parts of your brain when you don't feel safe. It just doesn't happen on a regular timeline. And once you see this, you can't look back. You see it everywhere. The second thing I think a lot about, nothing is personal. I know this because the trauma isn't because of me. The challenging behaviors happen in spite of me, and often the behaviors are even directed at me. But I know it's not personal because I've done my best to love and care for them. As I wait out my child's rage, I repeat this over and over again. As I leave work to handle some sort of situation that the child care provider could not, I say to myself, this is my child having a hard time. This is not personal. A third thing I think about is separating the person from the mental health issue. We all want to put our best selves forward. It's sort of the universal truth. For my children, mental health issues just get in the way. Several years ago, I began to reframe my thinking around my children's behaviors. I started to think of their behaviors as aliases. I created names for the aliases. There's Angry Andrew, there's Defiant Daniel, there's Wily William, there's Fussy Fernando, and all of these aliases are not my child. They are someone else. Compartmentalizing like this has helped me to help my child. There are abundant resources out there on how to calm and connect with your child. But as a parent, you have to be in the right space to be able to metaphorically pull out that toolkit. And these aliases, they help me to do that. So here's kind of how it would look. Okay, so I'm at my house. Angry Andrew is yelling at me. He's throwing books. I say to myself, he cannot hear me right now. Amygdala is in charge. What can I do to help Andrew so that he will go away and I can have my child back? This allows my logical brain to kick in so that I can help without having a reaction. And while I said there's abundant tools to help calm and connect with your child, a lot of times the first, the second, or the third thing doesn't work. So you gotta keep being able to pull things out of the toolkit until you can get the child calmed down and in a good place. And essentially the way I think of it is calm down and in a good place is like, whew, Andrew's gone, my lovely child is back. Nothing about parenting kids with mental health issues is easy. Literally nothing. And it takes every bit of patience and self-control I have some days. But being able to separate the child from the mental illness has been a huge step for me. Because the mental illness, to me, is the enemy. And we all want to defeat that. By thinking about mental illness as the bad guy, it really has helped me to strategize, come up with the game plan, and then execute. Feeds into my challenge drive. It's small scale, day to day, but it's really big impact when I'm able to help my child. When I can show him, we are a team. Me and him against the hard things. The fourth thing that I think about is sharing our stories. And this brings me to my last point. In August of last year, I had the opportunity to be part of a panel at my work of parents who shared their stories of raising kids with special needs. The event was the first of its kind, and it was very well attended. There was laughter, and there were tears, and there were people that came out of the woodwork to thank me and the others for sharing our stories for months following this event. Via email, in person, on-site, off-site, we had employees around the globe listening to this panel, and this leads me to believe that we must share our stories, and we must listen to each other. Many of the stories that I have heard in the last 6 years about mental illness and trauma have broken my heart. And I have used my heartbreak as fuel. This started for me with 2 lives. My sons have been my springboard, a springboard for school advocacy and childcare advocacy, of policy work around mental health care legislation, starting of an employee resource group to help employees, countless opportunities to really know people by listening and learning about struggles with mental health and their capacity to survive and fight and dream and live the real and the raw and the honest truth. And the truth is that I live at the edge of my comfort zone every single day because I parent kids with mental health issues. I'm on a throw your whole self in, life-changing, thought-altering, truth-seeking journey, and I'm a better person for it. On my arm, I have a tattoo. It says, "Awake and unafraid." This tattoo is my constant reminder to be awake, present, engaged, and listening, and unafraid. Do not fear the future, the unknown, or the mental illness. Mental illness is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And sometimes that's all I need to have empathy for people. I look at the whole world differently because hearing people's stories, being touched deeply by people's stories, it leaves a mark. I want you to think about this for a minute. Think about that obnoxious family member you might have, or that self-centered coworker. I want you to think about that friend with the terrible temper, or maybe the cousin that drinks too much, the neighbor that keeps to themselves, and ask yourself, what is their story? Because I guarantee if we could approach it with that kind of curiosity, empathy might win over mental illness. Over fear. And as you listen to people's stories, I challenge you to think for yourself, what breaks your heart? And how can we use this to propel ourselves into action? For me, it's about mental illness. I want to fight to make life better for those living with it, battling it, keeping that enemy at bay. And I want them to know that they are not alone. Those parenting children with mental illness, they are not alone. The way we collectively do this is by sharing our stories where we can and listening when we can, so that at the end of the day, we can shout from the rooftops, "Hey world, ready or not, here we come." Because the strength is in numbers. Mental illness impacts nearly everyone personally on some level. So take that stigma. We will not hide because there are stories to share. I'd like to take you back now, back to my story. Once upon a time, there was a girl who wanted to run a marathon, wanted to fly a plane, wanted to use advocacy to influence laws. She wanted to visit Antarctica. She wanted to end stigma around mental health. She wanted to help kids. She wanted no kid to ever feel like a bad kid because of their past. She wanted to live and love and be challenged and be free. She had really big dreams and loads of ambition to make them happen. She also knew the secret that happily ever after isn't the important part. It's all about once upon a time.